All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is your host, Pat Flynn. I am joined once again by Dr. Gaven Kerr, and we have a new guest today. Andrew Parrish is joining us also from Ireland. So we have, as you know, we like to bring in these international guests, these international superstars here to keep the Philosophy for the People channel spicy and interesting. And talking about spicy and interesting, boy, do we have a little bit of a different episode today. We're going to talk about chastity. We're going to ask Aquinas for a little bit of dating advice. So this is for anybody who thought that philosophy couldn't be practical. I mean, what could be more practical than this? So you can turn off Dr. Phil. You can tune into Philosophy for the People. And we're going to talk about Aquinas, chastity, virtue, vice, all that good stuff. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Let's begin with some brief introductions. Or Gavin, for you, would be like the 15th reintroduction, but it's appropriate. So, yeah, if you guys wouldn't mind, Gavin, we'll start with you. Who are you? What do you do? And then Andrew, you'll follow.
Yeah, so I'm Gaven Kerr. I've got a PhD in philosophy. I teach philosophy at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth. And I've just, written a few books on Aquinas, published a few articles, and just engaged with philosophy. So for any of the gentle listeners that don't know me, that's me. Yeah, and I'm a Belfast man. So up here in Belfast at the minute, I literally just got home from Maynooth about half an hour ago, and bounced onto the podcast here with Pat.
Beautiful. Well, always great to have you here, Gavin. Andrew, new face on the podcast. We met all of like 3 minutes ago. So great to have you here. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. Yeah, my name is Andrew Parrish. I'm here in Ireland, so I'm down in the south of the country. Gavin's gone back to Belfast. I'm in Maynooth. I've just completed the first year of a PhD program under Gavin. So I'm working on an extremely boring question in Immanuel Kant, which I won't trouble anyone with the details of. What I know of Aquinas mostly comes from reading Gavin's books and articles and listening to him talk about it up to this point. So I'm looking forward to hearing more. And I've been on a date in the past, so I guess that's the sum of my qualifications for joining you, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, this will be fun. This will be interesting. I'll be curious to see how many of personal stories we get into. So let's set the stage. Gavin, what prompted this conversation? Why don't you help contextualize this for us, and then we can start to talk about virtue, chastity, and what you think maybe some of the contemporary issues are, if you don't mind.
So it sort of came about. I've seen this issue come up in the past about how we can be Catholics, how we can be faithful Catholics, virtuous Catholics, and engage in, courtship is what it would have been called. So how men and women can go on dates, can form relationships leading to marriage, and remain virtuous. And I've seen this issue come up, really in the last decade or so, especially with a lot of the youth movements, not just in Ireland, but throughout Europe and in the States. There's rightly the emphasis on remaining chaste amongst these youth movements. But as these youth movements grow, and they're very devout, sometimes there's a sense that there's an overemphasis on chastity. And what I mean by that is that there's such overemphasis on chastity that individuals are seen as if they're sexual alcoholics, let's say, that, unless very strict and specific rules are put in place with which you have to abide, you will just inevitably be unchaste. And so there's usually a lot of distrust there of human nature and two human beings to be together and to form a wholesome and virtuous relationship. And it's been a phenomenon that's sort of, come more and more to the fore in the last 10 years. And I saw on one of the discussion groups on Facebook this very issue being discussed. And I thought, it's a bit odd the way this is being discussed. I mean, things don't need to be as puritanical as this. And so I thought, it might be interesting for Pat and I to sort of go back and forth on it, and, to bring Andrew in to get his perspective.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. So let me just kind of lay it on the table. So I'm married, obviously, right, to my wife, Christine, beautiful, wonderful, incredible, amazing woman. Gavin, you've been on her podcast actually, so
I have, yeah.
you've met Christine virtually.
Yeah.
But as most people know, we're converts to the Catholic faith, and we were together before we were religious. And yeah, let's say I did not engage in courtship, right? I actually lived a very thoroughly vicious, sinful life for many years. So, and then by God's grace, we converted after we were married. So this was like something that, I guess, never even really factored into my life for various reasons. But now I do notice in culture, and it seems like maybe it's a little bit more pronounced in Ireland, but there is this sort of, I guess we might want to call it a reactionary tendency. Is that kind of a way to say it, where people, even non-religious people, I notice this among non-religious people, are realizing that something has kind of gone wrong. There's a sort of depravity in our culture that has been tied up with promiscuity and sexual vice. And like I said, a lot of non-religious people notice this. In fact, like people like who follow Jordan Peterson seem to notice this. And so I think the way you described it, Gavin, is really interesting. They kind of see a sort of sexual alcoholism going on. That in order to combat it, they've sort of readopted maybe Puritan notions that, and let me ask you if you think I'm describing this right, that they're more worried about just avoiding becoming an alcoholic than they are about developing an actual virtuous character. Is that a fair way of summarizing it?
Yeah. And I mean, Andrew can come in on this because we've sort of chatted about this in the past. The attitude seems to be that when it comes to a relationship between men and women and forming a relationship, it's almost like a contractual engagement is being set out, whereby everybody knows what we ought not to do, but nobody's talking about how should we form ourselves as people so that our relationship can be allowed to flourish. And it kind of, ties in with some of the contemporary views about sin and about God, that if I only just refrain from sin, God's going to reward me with heaven. If I just refrain from doing the sinful things, he's going to reward me with heaven. But that's not how it works. You don't get close to God just by not sinning. You get close to God through, trying to form a character, a virtuous character, and inculcate, the theological virtues so that you can become friends with God. It's more about what you can do positively for yourself, not just avoid sin. And so the same with courtship. There seems to be, in the reactionary tendencies, an awful lot of emphasis on avoiding this, avoiding that. Always have a chaperone with you. Don't put yourself in this so-called occasion of sin. Instead of, forming the two individuals, forming their character so that they can form a kind of relationship which lasts well into the future. Andrew, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I would say, as someone who has experienced this directly and kind of lived through this for a couple of years, I'd like to maybe continue to set the question a bit more before jumping forward to courtship, because it really is this strange thing, and this is true in American Catholicism as well, not just Irish Catholicism or European Catholicism. So I want to add that to what Gavin's saying. But it's almost, I guess, as if the positive elements of a relationship are rendered implicit. They're kind of unspoken, right? Like the things that are good about a relationship or what you would get into a relationship with someone for is left kind of unstated in the background. And the only part that you're told is like, okay, don't get in trouble, don't commit some sort of sin. But then it really is difficult to communicate like how vague it is what you're supposed to do. And you kind of get the impression that if you're being a good boy or a good girl, you really spend your time like wandering around with this other person, just not sinning together. So I don't know if that helps sort of clarify more. It's just not only just like a puritanical, but even this kind of completely negative, like there is an absence in my experience where a catechetics or a theory of what male-female relationships are supposed to be like is where that would be. There's just nothing.
Yeah, that's a really good description, and this is fascinating to me because I mean, in many ways, I'm sort of very much detached from culture in many ways. So I don't notice these things maybe as much as the two of you do, but I have noticed this. And I think the point that's being emphasized is you don't right, you don't participate in goodness ultimately just by focusing on what not to do, right? You have to form a particular character, right? That's what human flourishing is about. So I like that. That's clear, and that's going to apply clearly across the board, not just the courtship. But we want to focus in on courtship and chastity. Before we get more into the particular problem as the two of you see it, it probably would be worthwhile to maybe say a few things about what chastity is, and is it a virtue? If so, why is it a virtue? So Gavin, help us understand this. Yeah, because certainly a lot of people don't think chastity is worth much these days. We can't forget the sort of the other extreme that has been the cause of this reaction that we're now talking about as well.
Yeah. So, well, chastity is a virtue. It's one of the virtues aligned under temperance, and what it does, and the virtues in general, they order our behavior, our actions to reason. So they make us more reasonable in our actions. And you have four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And fortitude and temperance, they govern our passions. So there are two types of passions. There are irascible passions, which are they're the passions where you get up and go, where you kind of, you're going to get in and you're going to kill it. That's the sort of passions which are referred to as the irascible passions. And they need order to reason. You can't be an animal in the world. You can't engage in the world or survive in the world unless you have these passions. And you need that get up and go passion. And that's so that you may overcome obstacles. But unless that's ordered to reason, things can go pretty bad for you if you just, submit to your irascible passions. So fortitude is what orders our irascible passions to our reason. But we have these other passions called concupiscible passions. And concupiscible passions are where we delight in what's pleasant. Okay, we want to enjoy what's pleasant. And concupiscence is the enjoyment of what is pleasant. And that needs order to reason as well. In order to be virtuous, we need to order that to reason. And the virtue of temperance is what orders that to reason. And chastity is one of the species of temperance because it's said to chastise concupiscence. It draws it in, it draws it back. So you imagine having this desire for something pleasant, and what chastity does is it draws it back. And chastity as a virtue is what reins in that concupiscible desire for the sexual act. Okay, so it's what reins in that concupiscible desire for the sexual act. Now think about that. You need these passions. You can't function as a human being without these passions. So with regard to concupiscence, you need to want to engage in the sexual act. In general, the species in general is going to need members who want to engage in the sexual act. That's going to be a pretty important feature of our human makeup. But if that just goes wild, out of control to an extreme, and it's not reined in by chastity, bad things can happen. And generally, somebody who is lacking in one virtue is lacking in, others as well. So somebody who is lacking in chastity may also be lacking in restraint when it comes to their irascible passions, their get up and go and conquering. And so you imagine the type of person who just lets, their sexual passions sort of run wild, and who also doesn't show restraint with regard to other passions as well. It leads to a somewhat unbalanced individual. So what chastity does then, we need that sexual urge, we need that sexual passion. Chastity just reins it in and orders it properly to reason. So it makes sure that you make reasonable use of that sexual desire. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
I have like kind of a complicated thought that you've just given me a hook to frame, but it might take us off course a little bit. So maybe I'll just throw it in and you can decide whether you want to.
We like going off course, so go ahead.
Yeah,
Hey, real quick,
we tend to do that.
Gavin, real quick, can you check your mic settings? Because I have a feeling that you're actually coming through your computer, not your headset. While Andrew does that, I could be wrong, but just if you could check it, that'd be sweet. All right, go ahead, Andrew. Yep.
So one of the things that Gavin just said was that chastity and the virtue of chastity kind of depends on this desire to engage in the sexual act. And I want to just throw out the idea as part of defining this sort of void that I really feel like chastity is kind of on one edge of at this point. I would say, you know, in the hookup culture that I've sort of been around the outside edges of, and nightclub music and the way people talk, you know, engaging in sexual activity in relationships for a lot of young people these days is much less about being like a red-blooded youth, and I would say much more about boredom and despair, like an inability to feel like anyone hears you, an inability to feel like there's any meaning to your life. And the sexual drive is not really this maybe because the full sexual act leads to children, right? So there's a way that you could say, you know, the desire to engage in the sexual act, which chastity is supposed to regulate, is sort of the full sexual act where you're integrated, you're using your body to express the desire to have children, you're looking forward to the future. Whereas hookup culture, I think I would describe much more as this kind of Cartesian, like Ghost in the Machine sort of, I'm using my body as a tool to feel temporarily rejoined to a common world of experience, you know. So I don't know if you see where I'm kind of going with all that, but I think maybe there's almost other virtues or a more general kind of sense of meaning or forward momentum in a human life that needs to be in play in relationships before the question of chastity proper even kind of comes into it with sexual activity. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, that it's really well articulated that when it's the sexual act and the sexual desire, the desire is for the full sexual act, whereas the hookup culture is just a kind of a boredom and a seeking to release that boredom by experiencing some kind of sexual pleasure. But it's not really, it's a kind of a counterfeit double of the genuine sort of sexual urge and sexual desire to engage in the sexual act, which is that, you know, complete one-to-one union of the two persons who come together. So there needs to be an interconnection and interweaving of all the different virtues, not just with regard to chastity, but also, you know, virtues pertaining to honesty, virtues pertaining to justice, and so forth, which will allow you then to embrace, you know, that sort of, you know, those concupiscible passions and the sexual urge to engage in the full sexual act.
Right. So, yeah, go ahead, Andrew. Do you want to add something else to that?
I guess, yeah, riffing off that, I would just say that maybe one of the things we can start to use as a building block here is like you actually want to encourage good Catholic kids who do like each other and who are tempted towards sexual activity as an expression of the fact that they're attracted to one another, instead of from this kind of deeper, more sad boredom. That desire for one another should be identified, I think, to them as being actually itself a component of chastity. Like it is the presence of the rightly, you know, sort of justly present desire that chastity is then going to come into operation to regulate.
Yeah.
But it's good that they, you know, they should be told that it's good that they're into one another. that's already sort of healthier than many people are.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost say, you know, with the misunderstandings of what chastity is amongst, you know, what I sort of see is a lot of Catholic youth in Ireland and the States and wherever, the misunderstandings is such that they seem to be focused on, what you would call an agapeix of chastity, the agape side of chastity.
Okay.
But they're not concerned with the erotics. You could call it or Will Desmond would call it the erotics of chastity, that it's actually okay to be attracted to another person. As you said at the start, Pat, about your wife, beautiful, lovely, wonderful lady. If you were not initially attracted to Christine, how would that relationship develop and move from an erotics of chastity to an agapeic relationship, whereby the heart speaks on the heart and you value each other as ends in themselves? And it seems, from what you're saying, Andrew, within the Catholic culture, which kind of really emphasizes the chastity side of things in the way that we think is inauthentic, there needs to be a return to this sort of idea of erotic engagement, that the concupiscible desire needs to be there precisely for that sexual urge to engage in the sexual act to take place, and that's all good, and that's all a necessary part of being human. All we need to do with chastity is regulate that to our reason.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm glad that you're taking the traditional perspective on this too, because there's going to be, like, and when I say traditional, I mean Aristotelian perspective, at least broadly considered. Catholics obviously have additional resources to motivate a chaste life, but I want to extend our case to all of our non-religious listeners and saying, no, y'all should want to be on board with this. And, I think you should want to be on board with being a Catholic too, obviously. But I'm saying, and that's why I highlighted before, it's very interesting. So far as I can tell, this isn't just in Catholic circles. Like I say, I spend some time on the internets and I see people who are not religious, again, kind of in this reactionary tendency, who seem to be missing the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is we're trying to pursue a life of flourishing, ultimately, right? Which requires ordering ourselves according to really the dictates of the natural law, right? Reason being our guide, right?
Yeah.
We have these appetites, we have these passions. They're there for a reason, right? They serve a purpose, a good and important purpose, but they can get out of control, right? They can start pulling the chariot in all different types of directions, and then you can be, you can become a pig, you can become a brute. I mean, we have terms for people who act, right, almost completely under the control of their passions. We say they're acting like a brute, an animal, right? Which means you're totally failing as a rational animal, right? Because your reason has been overridden. There's like an objective failing here in terms of like what the good life is, and you're not reaching it because your passions have gotten so out of control. Gavin, you bring up the remarks I said about my wife, and I mean every one of them, of course. Passion means to suffer, right? So is what it means. So in a sense, this type of love, we didn't bring up you brought up two of the four loves as C.S. Lewis talks about, agape and eros, right? So far as I know, only God has passionless love, right? Which is great. That's kind of what we want of God. But for the rest of us, we have these other loves, right? And they're all part of who we are, and they all have their right role to play in human flourishing. So the question is, how do we best order them, right? How do we best order them and get them into alignment? And all I'm saying in this is, whether you're religious or not, this should be something that should appeal to you, because everybody is interested in living a well-ordered and good life. And I think everybody can see, regardless of whether you want to go all the way with the Catholics on the idea of chastity, which I think you should, as in the way the church as a whole understands it, that there's something really wrong with our society and the just excessive promiscuity and hookup culture. Like, this is not healthy, right? People are really messed up because of this, right? They're really inhibited. Some of them really are sexual alcoholics. Like, that's not a totally illegitimate thing. Like, some people really are screwed up because of this. So sorry, I just unloaded a bunch there. So you guys can kind of pick at that however you like and steer us in whatever direction you want to go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the point, we need to come back to the point and re-emphasize the point, is that concupiscence in itself is neither good nor bad, okay? It's just a necessary passion we need for living a human life. Now, in a particular individual, it could be found that that individual has not ordered their concupiscence to reason, and so that individual has some work to do to get themselves back on track. But that doesn't mean that just by nature we're like these sexual alcoholics. I like to compare it to food, to dining, because eating needs to be governed by temperance as well. But we don't sort of, you don't see an awful lot of, Catholics and Catholic youths, really putting so much thought into how we eat and how we ought to eat and how we ought to regulate our eating by reason, even though the desire to eat, I mean, how would you say it's stronger than the sexual urge? I mean, the sexual urge comes and go, but the desire to eat, you're always going to have that desire to eat. So it's much more omnipresent, and yet there's not as much thinking goes in, not as much worrying and concern goes into our relationship with food as to our relationships with other people when we're courting them. Andrew, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple things. I think that Pat, you're right to call in this broader Aristotelian kind of picture. The way the virtues work in the ethics for Aristotle, of course, is that we can pick out individual virtues as being sort of strains that are identifiable because they apply to a specific kind of category of actions. But for Aristotle, the virtuous person is sort of balanced in this web of virtue that's just called forth and crystallized in specific directions by certain circumstances, and then it gets a name as magnanimity or whatever. But it's sort of this picture of a holistic kind of integrated life. And then also you brought in the four loves, which has of course been kind of hovering in the background here for a little while now. And the two other loves are friendship and affection. And one of the really important things that Lewis says about friendship and affection as loves is that they kind of take off the hard edge of erotic desire, which is what I think we've been discussing here. Like, if you're affectionate with someone that you love and you're friends with them, it makes it much easier for you not to allow your divine erotic desire for them to become demonic and to create an idol of them and then destroy them. And I think both of those things kind of twined together are leading me towards this idea. I think you're absolutely right. Everyone can see that the hookup culture and the way that we treat sexual desire as being isolated on its own is totally destructive. I mean, what I always find so striking is the very same pop music on the radio that glorifies sexual desire is also full of these reflections and recriminations on how painful it is and how much sadness and misery there is in living this way. And I've found that in terms of what I would call courtship, right? Thinking about this earlier, one of the things that I've really tried to do consistently over the years is introduce myself as soon as possible to the father of the girl that I'm going out with, and kind of place her within that context of her family and these other connections and get this sort of 360-degree view, right? And I find that those sorts of things, you can make an intentional effort to do that. You can make an intentional effort to remember to take off sort of the sharp edge of an eros and place it back within friendship and affection. If what I'm getting at is making sense to you both, I don't know if that makes sense, but I would say that's an important piece of what I understand by courtship. Is not necessarily this kind of ritualized schedule or calendar of progression of a relationship so much as it is always trying to hold the other person within this like affective, affectionate, familial kind of context. You see sort of all of what they are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Andrew. And maybe we should articulate the reactionary tendencies that I think you and Gavin are trying to warn people about. And that is essentially just having a long list of no-nos, right?
Yeah.
So like no holding hands, no kissing, no being alone without a chaperone. I don't know. Gavin, fill out the list for us. What are these lists of no-nos, and why must we go beyond the no-nos? What do right? Is that right? Trying to keep it
really
simple
those
for the
three
people.
Yeah, those three really are the ones that I always see kind of in a lot of these discussions and on these lists, that to be chaste, it's no holding hands, no kissing, and no being alone together without a chaperone. And I want to come back to something that Andrew said, because it relates to chastity within courtship, and it's that the different kinds of love help to sort of take off the hard edges of eros. And that's within an Aristotelian context, that's embedded in the fact that the virtuous person isn't virtuous because he's following a rule or avoiding things that he ought to do or ought not to do. The virtuous person isn't struggling with being virtuous. The virtuous person, if he is virtuous, finds it easy to be virtuous because he's taken the time to work on his character so that it's second nature to him to be virtuous. So the virtuous person wants to perform the virtuous act and refrain from vice, not because it's a no-no to do vice, but because he wants to do the right thing and not the wrong thing. And so with regard to chastity, a person who is genuinely chaste will not want to engage in hookup culture behaviors with his girlfriend or her boyfriend if they're genuinely chaste. So there isn't needed a list of no-nos when you have the virtue of chastity. And so if you've got, Catholic youth or whatever, or, people in general trying to, navigate the tricky waters of, courtship, the best thing that they can do is seek to grow and develop in virtue and virtue of character, and help each other grow in virtue, instead of just, coming up with a set of rules, which the virtuous person doesn't need anyway.
So let me ask, this is for both of you then. How would you help facilitate that, right? Because I think part of the reason that, I don't know, parents or teachers or even the youth go to the list of no-nos is it seems simple, it seems straightforward. But if you read Aristotle, you don't get lists of no-nos, right?
Yeah.
You don't get that with Aristotle, right? And there's a reason for it, because the right action depends upon the circumstances and the intentions and all these other myriad factors, right? This is why the sort of the ethics, the traditional ethical perspective is sort of, I hesitate to use the phrase because people might misunderstand it, but it's a sort of objective relativism, right? Or a relative absolutism, right? When you understand what the moral life really is, right? There is an objective, proper moral fact of the matter, but what that is will depend on the person, the circumstances, the intentions, all these different things, right? So that's why it's really hard to just have a list, right? To just have these moral manuals that will automatically form you into a virtuous person. That just isn't how it works. So what do you guys advise then here? Because, it's good to obviously say, yeah, this seems to be in the maybe not the best way to do things, but we want to do more than that, right? We want to try and offer something. There's something positive here. So what do we got?
Well, I'll let Andrew go first.
Yeah.
Oh, you're gonna let me go first. Okay. I was hoping I could think about what I wanted to say while you were talking.
Well, I know what I want to say, but do you want me to take it first, Andrew, or do you have an idea?
I can go. I think the word positive for me is the key, because I'm reminded of the distinction between the old law and the new law that Jesus talks about and Paul talks about, where the 10 Commandments are a list of no's, and you need them there in order to get started. If you have no inner sort of desire for the good or an instinct developed at all for what the good is like, then what you need is to be told no by somebody as you sort of develop your own sense of virtue. And that's kind of what parents are for, I think.
Can I say something right there? Because that's a great point, right? And I don't want to say that a list of no-nos is never appropriate, because then why did God give us the 10 Commandments? That's right. Some things are so obvious, or should be so obvious, right? Or so cut and dry that, this is a hard no. But even within the 10 Commandments, and I think this is the reason why having something like a magisterium is helpful, because, okay, thou shalt not kill. Okay, what about self-defense? What about war? right? Like there's like very quickly, right? You start to get into circumstances where it's not exactly cut and dry or very clear anymore. So I just wanted to connect those two things. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think just to keep unfolding that point, like, there's the list of regulations that form the commandments, but then they do have an inner sort of spirit, which is disclosed slowly over time and then fulfilled in the coming of Christ, where he explains like what it was actually about. But there are virtuous people in the history of the Old Testament who got it in advance, and those are sort of the righteous friends of God, like David or these other people who could see that it was really about love. And that if you loved, you no longer needed to rely on the commandments or to understand them in this kind of external way. So like one problem with I think that's what's missing is an articulation of the positive sort of inner experience of loving rightly. That would be my end answer to your question. So the problem is when you only have the commandments and people have not been sort of given a hint in the right direction with an articulation of what how true love is really fulfilling, you get situations where people, in American Catholic chastity literature, this is phrased as how far is too far, right? That's the question you say you're not supposed to ask. If you ask that question, you're not understanding it right. But people do that all the time. And then it's like, okay, well, we're good because we didn't go too far. But you have already passed over the boundary at which you're abusing the other person in your heart, right? So people think that they're being chaste or continent, but they're still arguing with each other and angry and hurt, and they don't understand why. And then when you have a hint about what it's really supposed to be like, it starts to dawn on you like, oh, I don't have to be near this person in order to do this in the wrong way. Like there's a kind of gaze or a kind of thought which is already, the seed of an abuse of this person's dignity. So that's what I would say is like, I mean, maybe even just more poetry, like more sort of song and art about how great lovers act and how they see one another. Would be inspiring not only to Catholics, but to anyone who feels that there's something wrong with the way that things are now.
Yeah, that's excellent, Andrew.
I think what Andrew says is right there, because part of being chaste is treating the other person as a subject of value and not using them as an instrument, as an object for one's own ends. So when you're asking how far is too far, you're really thinking, how much can I make use of this other person before it's considered wrong? So if that's even your attitude, then you're lacking in the virtues. The kind of the direction I was going to take, it's a very practical one. It's because Pat, you're a father. You've got daughters, and you have a son as well, don't you?
I have one son, 3 daughters, and number 5 is on the way.
Oh, really? Is this new? Is this news?
Relatively, actually. So due date is early July, and boy, girl, we will find out.
Oh, congratulations!
Well, thank you very much.
All about this when this happens.
Yeah, I thought I've definitely announced it on the podcast, but I'm sorry if I didn't tell you, Gavin. But yeah, number 5 is on the way. Yeah, thanks be to God.
Brilliant. Well, we're thinking, as fathers of, parents of children, there's always this, grand old tradition that the parent has to sit down and have the sex talk with the teenage child, and they have a different one for the teenage daughter than the teenage son, and they're directed in different ways. And it's not telling them how sex works; it's more about how to navigate the waters of engaging in a sexual relationship. And to my mind, I don't know how you feel about that, Pat. To my mind, that's just cringe. Neither the parent nor the child is going to, enjoy that. And, for some reason, there's a feeling that this has to be done, that the father has to warn, the young man, the young teenage boy off pursuing girls and, having sex with girls, and that the mother has to, warn the young daughter away from boys, and all the rest. But I think part of the reason why that's a bit of a problem is that if you need to have a sex talk with your child, or you feel that you need to have the sex talk with your child, there's something that you feel that your child is not mature or wise about, and that you have to fill them in on that wisdom. Whereas if you do things in such a way that the child grows in virtue, grows in character, you realize that their character is formed in such a way that you don't need to do the sex talk, because because the virtuous person does the right thing in the right circumstances at the right time. So you can be confident that your child who has been brought up in virtue will want to live the good life, and so you won't need to have that sex talk with them. And I think the way to do that, and the way you get this from Aristotle, is that you find somebody who is wise in virtue.
I was going to say, you find the moral role models, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And if you as a parent feel that you can't be a moral role model, well, you do what, Andrew suggested, more poetry. You have an enriching culture within the situation, in the school, in the home. You provide a lot of these moral role models. You seek to be one for yourself, but you also expose your children as much as possible to a more wholesome culture that will enrich their character, so that it's easier for them to grow in virtue. In which case, you won't have to have that sex talk and the warning them off each other, and the creating an awful lot of hassle. But I think, this is another point we can go on to. I think a lot of this sort of reactionary overemphasis on chastity, brings about just as much pain and hurt as the hookup culture. They're both extremes. The hookup culture brings about very explicit, very, very visceral pain and hurt. But this reactionary, sort of chastity culture carries with it a little more under the surface pain and hurt, because I think it just makes forming wholesome relationships difficult for young people by constantly forcing them to have on their mind what they can and cannot do, instead of allowing them to be themselves and grow into their relationship together.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Kevin. I was going to talk about the moral role model, so I have nothing to add to that. You hit everything I wanted to focus on, and that is a fantastic point at the end there too. By the way, I see questions are coming in here, have been coming in, so I would like to dedicate some time to some Q&A if you guys are cool with that, at least towards the end here. But I want to make sure that we hit everything that we wanted to hit in this discussion first. So Andrew, any follow-up thoughts on anything that Gavin just said? And then, Gavin, what else do you want to say about this conversation? And in fact, I titled this Aquinas on Dating. We haven't said much about Aquinas himself. We've talked a lot about Aristotle. Maybe I should change the title, Aristotle on Dating. But Aquinas did say stuff on chastity, and maybe we should get around to him specifically at some point. So yeah, Andrew, you first, and we'll go back to Gavin.
Yeah, just real quick. I really liked what you said there, Gavin. And at the end, I think it helped me clarify. I think that they're both hurtful almost because they share kind of dialectically this underlying assumption that the other gender is dangerous, right? Which I think has caused an untold amount of damage in the United States, right? Like, women think that all men are dangerous, and men think that women are dangerous. And that sort of forecloses you from the beginning. Makes it very difficult to get around to the perspective where you can see that sacrificing yourself for the sake of someone of the other gender is like the highest happiness that you can reach. That's when you really feel sort of fulfilled, is when you feel free to completely kind of empty yourself out for a woman or for a man, like knowing that they appreciate that and will take care of you in return. So that underlying, I think, idea that the sexual other is a source of danger or destruction or whatever is maybe something we need to work to overcome as well.
Okay, Gavin, what else have we? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to follow up with the idea there that with this overemphasis on reactionary chastity, that it's just following a set of rules, following a set of no-nos. If that's how you see your relationship with another, you'll just not empty yourself for the good of the other, and vice versa, because you're always going to be governed by these sets of rules. not and not by your heart. Basically, you're not going to be able to give your heart to another, because you're always going to have these regimented rules, these contractual obligations in mind whenever you seek to give yourself to the other.
So I was going to say, Gavin, what haven't we hit yet on this conversation that you think is important, or that you want to impress upon the gentle audience here?
I mean,
before we turn to some questions.
I think that we have got to the heart of the matter, that there's that this reactionary kind of view about chastity and how it influences courtship is, well, first of all, it's not consistent with an Aristotelian Thomistic account of the virtue of chastity. So it's just not consistent with that. The second point is that it's problematic for how we envisage relationships growing and developing, particularly between young people. We need to encourage young people to be virtuous and to grow in virtue, because that's what leads to authenticity. But when we just, put in place, a list of do's and don'ts, we inhibit the growth of virtue. And the final thing is that it doesn't allow, or it really restricts the ability of two lovers to give themselves totally to each other, because they'll always feel that their self-giving has to be restricted by these rules. But the virtuous person does the right thing in the right way, in the right circumstances. So the virtuous person can give his or her heart to each other in the right way, in the right circumstances. So,
yeah,
I mean, I think we've hit all the sort of, the nails I wanted to hit.
I knew this would be a fascinating and fruitful conversation, and I have not been disappointed. Andrew, what are your summary or final thoughts? And then we'll turn to some questions from the audience here to finish up.
I think that's about it. And I was scrolling through the comments actually just now, getting a sense of how much chaos and controversy we've caused on the internet.
We have good people that listen to this channel. So
yeah, the good, gentle listeners.
I think maybe sort of the overall takeaway that I'm getting, which would go some distance towards answering a lot of these questions that I just briefly saw, was it's not that the regulation of sexual activity and knowing what the rules of sexual activity are and having a knowledge of these things, it's not that all of that isn't important, but what is missing in sort of a relative proportion of emphasis is how that's placed within the larger project of becoming a good human being, which is both the Aristotelian and the Catholic project, right? You're saving your soul, constituting yourself as a human being, and loving another person takes on a lot of additional dimensions, which are not just physically sexual, but there's all these other components of, am I treating this person justly? Am I being fair? Am I being honest? Am I being honorable? Am I being magnanimous? And, so that would be what I would say, I think.
Most excellent. Let's take some questions if you guys are okay with that. I'll spend a few minutes here. I'm going to look for the questions that are not because any questions are unimportant or uninteresting, but I'm going to pick out the questions that relate to today's topic, at least first.
Pat, I see a question.
Yeah, you go ahead. If there's one you guys want to take, please take it. Which you go ahead, make a selection.
She's not going to forgive me, but the indefatigable Neve Palmer put a question in there.
Well, she did put a question in there, so you might as well answer it.
Yeah, or else she will ask me when she sees me the next
there
time.
There it is. Sorry, I found it. There it is. While I understand what you mean, Gavin, about teaching children to be virtuous, surely some education of talk and sex is important. Yes? Question mark. What do we say about that, Gavin?
Yeah. So, hey, Neve, thanks for the question. I agree. There has to be some sort of education and talk about sex. But what I mean when I say you don't have the sex talk with your children, I mean the sort of sex talk where you sort of, warn them about the dangers, of being in a relationship with somebody else. Obviously, there needs to be some sort of education around sex and sexual activity. And that's grand, because children need to be educated. But I just mean, given dating advice and courtship advice to our children, is a recognition that they're lacking in some sort of wisdom, which you're trying to provide. And so I think that providing the moral role models and the environment within which a child can develop all the virtues, because it's all the virtues they have to develop, will entail that the child isn't lacking in that sort of prudential wisdom, which will allow them to make judgments in particular cases and in particular circumstances, and will allow them to make judgments about chastity in those particular circumstances.
Excellent. Andrew, any follow-up to that?
That covers it.
Satisfied customer. Very good. Okay, let's move on. Gavin, stealing your name, Gavin. Gavin wants to know from Gavin and Andrew, what should one look for in a potential husband or in a potential wife under a Catholic context?
Okay. Well, I've already got the perfect wife, so I could just, list you, Colette's attributes.
Just go down the list of attributes.
Well, maybe I'll say a few things then, Andrew, if you want to come in. So I could say something, is married, and Pat, you might have, something as well. But I think initially you have to. You need to be attracted to the person. You have to at least have some sort of physical attraction to the person that you're thinking is a potential husband or basically a potential spouse. But more than that, there has to be. You have to move beyond that sort of eros and get to the more agape level, whereby you really see and value this person as another self. You see them as another self. We generally tend with the human beings that we see every day to see them as objects. But whenever you see this person as another self, I think that's whenever kind of the heart starts to speak on the heart, and you're able to give yourselves to each other, because in seeing the other as another self, you start to become ready and willing to give yourself fully to that other self, and God willing, vice versa. So I think when there's that attraction, and then the beginning to really see and value the other person as another self, that's whenever things start to click, I think, in a relationship. That's what I think one should look for in a spouse. Certainly what I find in a spouse.
Andrew, any remarks here on that?
Yeah, I'm not married or in a relationship, so you can take my comments on this with a grain of salt. But I've always thought that it was just sort of the fundamental thing was to be able to be friends with the person that you're married to, and then a piece of advice that I got recently that I really liked was, instead of focusing on looking for a set of qualities that was kind of out there in another hypothetical person that you were trying to find that suited you, it's much more productive to focus on just being as authentically yourself as you can be with everyone that you meet, and really making an effort kind of not to lie to people subconsciously by concealing parts of who you are. Because then you just sort of naturally end up surrounded by people who are a good fit for you.
Yeah.
And when that finally sort of clicked for me recently, I was like, oh yeah, that's so much easier than what I was doing before, So that's my contribution.
Yeah. I am like you, Gavin. I actually have the perfect wife. So apparently there can be more than one perfect being in the world. How about that?
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
my marriage is an incredible blessing, but it is also an incredible gift of God, right? So I'm always kind of a little hesitant to answer something like this, because when I first met Christine, I was a hardcore libertarian naturalist was my paradigm, right? She was a liberal feminist. Now we're both trying to live devout Catholic lives, right? So it just we just just where we are now is so different than when we first met. And look, our marriage really struggled for a lot of years because we had some things in common, but we didn't have anything really fundamental in common, right? If that makes sense. And that was it was a real point of tension for us. And in a real sense, I think that God not only saved but elevated our marriage through our conversion. And the sacramental understanding of marriage, let me tell you, it makes all the difference in the world for everything that Gaven just said, that the marriage is man, woman, and God. And the point of marriage is you each have a sort of, you're tied by a rubber band. You're each on the side of a mountain of salvation, pulling each other up, right? As one falls, the other is there as support to kind of band the other person higher up to the peak of perfection. And that for me, by God's grace, was just such a critical point of transformation, as seeing my wife as another self rather than as a sort of, let's be honest, a sort of utilitarian friendship in a lot of ways. That was a fundamental shift I had to make. And again, by God's grace, I think did make. And but I'm always like who am I to give dating advice at the same time? It was such a mess for so many years starting out. And then, it got to where it went. So I'm always just a little bit hesitant, to kind of to venture in that direction, just because of where I think what I can offer are mostly things that I did that, looking back, were mistakes that I wish that I would, and really just living a life of sinful narcissism would be the primary. Don't do that. Stay away from that. That's not good. The other thing I would say related to that is, I think fundamental value commitments are important. I know some people disagree with me, but I've got a number of friends that are single, and they've thought about, dating or courting somebody who is not Catholic. I think that's a mistake, honestly. I think it's good that you have things that are not in common. Like, me and my wife are very different people in many different respects. She likes stuff I don't like, food I don't like, shows I don't like, music I don't like. And this is interesting as an interesting dynamic. But on the fundamental commitments now, we're the same, right? Our fundamental value commitments, what we believe in, what we care about, our priorities are very much aligned. And I think one of the problems early on in a relationship is, we were like deeply physically attracted to each other, but it was exceedingly superficial, and we didn't have what we needed for that really deeper, meaningful, virtuous friendship, as Andrew was talking about, because we didn't have fundamentals in common, if that makes sense. So I don't know if you guys agree with that, but that's something that springs to mind that I think, if I were to offer advice tentatively, I think that would be included in it.
Yeah, I think, what you say there is all true. And I really want to come back to this point, that just being with your spouse makes you a better person. Okay. And, I think, marriage, it's like, it's God's greatest invention, because, it's, these two people that, each individually are just broken in their own very ways. But the way in which you're broken may not be the way in which your spouse is broken. Your spouse's lack of brokenness makes you better, and vice versa. And so it's no surprise that, our Lord treats marriage as a way to heaven, as a ticket to heaven, just by living the married life and being within that marriage. You're living a sacrament. Okay, you're living a sacramental life, and that's your way. That's your ticket to heaven. For those who are married, but it all comes down to that gift of the other self, which makes you a better person, and challenges you to live a life worthy of this other self that has given himself or herself to you. When it comes then to the fundamental values, I've always sort of thought about this back and forth. If you're giving yourself to this other person and vice versa, but you are opposed on fundamental value issues, and not silly value issues. Pat, you talk about, liking different music. My wife likes power metal. My wife likes Dragon Force.
Nice, dude. Yeah.
There's no death metal or thrash metal in her. Okay. She doesn't.
That's an
interesting.
That's an interesting point of contrast there.
Yeah.
My wife, she likes like bands like the Mountain Goats and stuff like that, and I'm the metal guy. It's not like we each like a different kind of metal. That's interesting. You don't see that often.
Yeah. Well, my wife is just a complete heavy metal heretic. But she is doing kung fu now, and she's just this sort of badass sort of Belfast woman who is now learning deadly kung fu skills. The world's not ready for that, but And I mean, you can have those little sort of differences, but when you're giving yourself fully to the other and vice versa, if you disagree fundamentally on fundamentals, how much of yourself can you give to the other? Okay. If you really, disagree on these fundamental issues, I mean, take for instance, if, somebody was pro-life and pro-choice, how much really can one give to each other? Will there always be that constant worry or suspicion, if a pregnancy occurs that, it might be terminated? These sorts of things, they do hamper, the self-giving. But also at the same time, I mean, at the initial stages of a relationship, if there is that sort of fundamental value disagreement, sometimes it could be because of something in one of the individual's lives that has kind of brought about this outlook or this view. And sometimes it could just be another self who maybe, will be able to bring somebody back from the edge and bring them back to kind of seeing a more virtuous, a more genuine or authentic point of view. So sometimes, but I mean, that tends to be at the beginning of a relationship, certainly with regard to marriage. If there is deep fundamental disagreement, there is going to be trouble about how much they can give and trust of each other. And a priest friend of mine pointed this out, because he agrees with you, Pat, totally, about, especially when it comes to something like Catholicism. Whenever children comes along and it comes to baptisms, communions, sacramental preparations, schools, all that sort of, there's a whole interconnected web there that if one is Catholic and the other is non-Catholic, the non-Catholic is going to have to do an awful lot of compromising, and that's going to affect then the underlying relationship. Maybe not in an immediate way, but it is going to put severe stress and strain on the relationship.
Yeah.
Andrew, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just being sort of much farther back in this process than either of you two gentlemen are, I think. From my point of view, it's still just the most important part of this process for me right now is just knowing what values I have and being able to articulate them. This is kind of a watershed moment for me, maybe like 6 months ago. A while back, I wasn't sure whether I was going to say this, but a while back, I had one of those conversations with your mom where it's kind of like, okay, my mom was like, she's like, Andrew, you're thinking about, going out on dates and like trying to find a way to get married, but you don't have a job. I thought about that for a while.
Thanks,
like,
Mom.
yeah, exactly. So I thought about that for a little while, and I was like, yeah, okay. I looked at the whole situation. I realized like I don't know. Not only do I not know what my values are, but as a young man, like I didn't know where I was going at the time. I didn't know what my life trajectory was going to be, what the things were that were most important to me to accomplish with my life. And those are sort of all of the features of myself that I needed to be able to present to somebody else in order to even get started down this road of eventually getting involved in a serious relationship. And it seems like there's kind of a mix of long time married and then maybe unmarried people in the comments. So if there's anybody who's sort of more on my end of the spectrum, I think that's what I would say. It's like just you need to find who you are and be able to articulate who you are to other people. And I think that if you end up doing that in the early stages of a marriage, if you do love each other, you'll survive. But it's much easier, I think, if you have a strong sense of this beforehand.
So we're not gonna. First off, that's great, Andrew. We're not gonna have time to get all the questions here. They're really good ones, but as always, there's just more questions than we have time to spend answering. But we appreciate all the contributions. What I'd like to do is, Gavin and Andrew, why don't you both kind of like pick one of the maybe questions that stands out to you that you'd like to answer. Gavin, why don't you go first, and we'll close out with 2 more questions, and I'll let you guys have the pick of what you want to speak to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I see there's another Gavin spelled with an I there. Yeah, that's the one. Do you want to read it out?
Yeah, I'll read this one. So Gavin says, how does a spouse not become a means to an end? If heaven is the goal and marriage is the call you have to get there, how does your spouse not just become just the means to your salvation, especially since we will not be married in heaven? Yeah, Gavin, how should we think about this?
So when one enters into a marriage, one enters into a union whereby one is made better, one is made more complete, one is made authentic. And so one's being is transformed when one enters into that marriage, such that one is then fit for heaven. So, I mean, I talk about, that's your ticket to heaven, that's a very sort of colloquial way, of talking about it. But it's true that in entering into the marriage, one then is, basically just made fit for heaven. So it's not using one spouse to get to heaven, because in a sense, in being married, like with any sacrament, one has a foretaste of heaven. Okay, so one has a foretaste of the sort of the love that God will have for us, and the eternal life for which we're all destined. That's what one gets through any sacrament, but particularly in marriage, one gets that taste of the other self, for which one totally lives and to which one totally gives oneself. So in that sense, your spouse isn't being used. Okay, your spouse isn't an instrument for some sort of end. Your spouse is the end, because your spouse is the presence of God in your life.
Yeah, that's so important to emphasize the sort of non-competitiveness here and how we participate in the good. It's by willing the good of our spouse as end that we become the loving sort of character that makes us compatible with the beatific vision, right?
Yeah.
That's the understanding that we need to have of marriage and really salvation and character formation in general. So yeah, excellent points there. Andrew, anything in the comments that sticks out to you that you'd like to highlight or speak on before we close this one out?
Yeah, there was one back at 7:39 p.m. that I thought was worth retrieving and picking up.
7:39 p.m. is your guys' time. I need a name.
Oh, meow, meow, meow.
Meow,
oh,
meow,
yes,
meow.
yes.
Yeah.
Here we go. Meow, meow, meow. Yes, good. Great man he is, and supporter of the channel. He says, on your view, is it permissible for barren married couples to seek out sexual pleasure for its own sake, or is that, or at least as a means for bonding, expressing love? So clearly this is with the sort of view of traditional natural law sexual ethics in mind. Yeah, how do you want to speak to this, Andrew? And then maybe Gavin, you could offer some comments too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just I wanted to bring that in as a way to return to this idea that we need to be emphasizing the good side of these things and focusing on the positive. And I think that John Paul II really did the church a service in clarifying all of this stuff and really preaching about the beauty of married love, and the goodness of sexuality, and the fact that it is, permissible and beneficial. It's good for married people to enjoy intercourse with each other. It's supposed to be good, which I think is one of the things that kind of falls through the cracks with this very puritanical influence. And I think that's a negative influence in both the Irish and the American church. And then also there was a comment way back at the beginning about how the focus is more on theology of the body in the United States. But again, I would say I really, in my own journey through the American Catholic Church, I haven't seen very much good theology of the body. A lot of it has been perverted around to this kind of, chastity as continence argument. And it's unfortunate that's been done, because it's placed this filter over what John Paul II actually says about the beauty of married love, which is the antidote to this erroneous idea of what chastity is supposed to be. So that I think that's my response to that question. No.
Awesome. Gavin, anything to add to that?
Just that when it comes to what you're intending when engaging in the sexual act, we need to make clear that we can engage in intentional activity and an intentional action without thinking about what we're doing. We can do something intentionally without thinking about it. So when it comes to the sexual act, the full sexual act is that, sexual intercourse, but the end of the sexual act isn't, pregnancy. That's not the end of the sexual act. That kind of comes about usually once the sexual act ends. The end of the sexual act is that union between the two. But one is intentionally engaged in that when one engages in union. The sexual, sort of pleasure, joy, and all the rest. Well, I mean, as good Aristotelians, pleasure comes about whenever a faculty is brought to its natural end. That's whenever we experience what is pleasant, and so that coincides with the end of the sexual act, with what's going on in the sexual act. So I don't think you can divorce the two of them. The two are as one. If one is engaged in the sexual act for its end, for its proper end, then the sexual fulfillment, that just comes with that. And if a couple is wanting that, it doesn't mean that they're not wanting the other, even when they are barren, because all that is required is the completion of the sexual act, not the pregnancy, because nobody can will to get pregnant. One can only will to do the sorts of things that one usually does to bring about pregnancy, but nobody can will a pregnancy to occur. We just put in place the conditions. But if there are conditions extrinsic to the sexual act itself, which means pregnancy doesn't occur, such as barrenness, well, that doesn't change the intrinsic, ordering of the sexual act. So, I mean, those who are barren, there's no issue there. I don't see there to be any issue.
Yeah, excellent. Very, very, very good. All right, gentlemen, this has been a tremendously awesome and useful conversation. I'm sure many people will find it very, very balanced and hopefully very helpful in their own lives. Before we go, Gavin, Andrew, please let us know what you guys are working on. What's coming up? Any cool projects? Any new conferences? Give us all the details. Give us a scoop.
Yeah. So both Andrew and I, including a few others, I may as well give him a shout out because he's watching. Sean Palmer, was helping out at the big conference here at St. Patrick's, and we're just coming out of that. So it started last week on the Wednesday, and it went right through to the Saturday. Absolutely exhausted, shattered by the end of it. I think Andrew went back, went to bed at 7 on the Saturday and wasn't up until midday. I went home and ran in the Belfast Marathon the next day. So,
I don't know how to do that.
So I'm just, you can hear my voice is going. So I'm just recovering after that. But I delivered a paper on philosophy at the intersection, which was pretty well received, and so I'm excited about this because it's developing a line of philosophical thinking, very close to what Jim Madden and I were talking about when we were on about time, mind, and world relate to each other, and I'm sort of expanding on that view about mind and world as a kind of a model way of philosophizing, the way in which we do philosophy. We can draw all sorts of implications for that. And I'm very pleased that I got to talk about centerline theory in the paper. So I got to bring Kung Fu into this presentation to these 20, keynote speakers, including David Bentley Hart and Rowan Williams and Thomas Joseph White. So it was a great session. And then in terms of projects, I always have a ton of stuff going on. So there's the two book projects, one of which you and I are writing, Pat, and then we've got I've got another book project, hopefully, reaching its final stages. And then I've got 2 more books that I want to write, and that have been suggested to me to write. I also just had an article. I'm having an article published on faith, and I've got several articles coming out in Nova Vetera.
That reminds me, we want to do an episode on that faith article that you have, Gavin. I would love to do that.
Absolutely. So I'm all over the place, but I'm doing a lot of stuff, staying busy.
Yeah, excellent. Andrew, how about you? First off, we'll have to have you back on, Andrew. It's been a real treat having you here about it. But what are you working on? Aside from your PhD, of course.
Right. I appreciate that, Pat. Thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you guys. Yeah, so since I'm a doctoral student and my doctoral supervisor happens to be participating in this conversation, of course, the main thing that I'm working on is my doctoral dissertation, if anybody asks. I am doing the post-production for all of the videos of the conference. So those should be finished sometime in the next couple weeks. And then that'll be sort of our contribution for the spring to the YouTube blogosphere, more philosophy available on the internet for the people.
Will you have, for example, will that be like a video of all the speakers? Will that all be available?
As far as I know, so I'm just mastering everything. I recorded every session. I recorded Desmond's inaugural talk, and then we had an awesome sort of unexpected roundtable at the end, which I recorded as well. That really got into some cool stuff. And then I'm going to turn all that over to the marketing department at St. Patrick's, and hopefully they see fit to release it all for everybody. But I'm not sure yet.
Awesome. Well, we will keep people updated on that because I'm sure they'll be very interested in the content. So yeah, a pleasure, gentlemen, as always. So gentle listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you like what we're doing here, please continue to support this channel. And the way you do that is just by sharing it. Let people know what's up. Tell grandma what's up at Philosophy for the People. Please like, please share, please subscribe, and we will catch you next time. Bye-bye.